This is a quick guide to the Pfalz E.I, a German single-seater monoplane fighter of World War I that saw service during the Fokker Scourge. Pfalz Flugzeugwerke was, at the outset of World War I, a new aeronautical manufacturer that had been formed in June 1913 by brothers Alfred and Ernst Eversbusch and their brother-in-law Willy Seversky Müsingbord, with the intent of building licensed designs from Albatros Flugzeugwerke. However, that deal fell through because it was too expensive. Another, cheaper arrangement quickly followed with Gustav Otto Flugmaschinenfabrik, followed shortly by still another with French manufacturer Morane-Saulnier. Production commenced in 1914, but limited numbers were produced before war were declared. The Pfalz E.I was a license-built Morane-Saulnier Type H. So, along with its more famous contemporary, the Fokker Eindecker, it had a shared ancestry, the latter also being developed from the Morane-Saulnier Type H. In essence, then, the Fokker Scourge involved aircraft of French origin being used to shoot down French and British aircraft. This isn't as surprising as it sounds. In the lead-up to World War I, there was considerable knowledge in the public domain about aircraft development. Even the first purpose-designed fighter, the Vickers FP5, had been in the public eye during its development, and the Germans had even expressed an interest in it. Powered flight was only about a decade old, and the designers and their products were well known and followed by the aviation press of the time. So it is inevitable that similar, or the same, designs would see adoption by nations that in only a few years or months would be fighting each other. The Morane-Saulnier Type H had been flying since 1913 and was a successful sport and racing aircraft. So when, in April of 1915, Fokker Eindecker demonstrated the success of its interrupter gear, which allowed a machine gun to fire through the propeller arc without destroying it, Pfalz Flugzeugwerke similarly mounted an MG08-15 light machine gun on its aircraft, and along with an Oberursel U0 rotary engine developing 80 horsepower, the result was the Pfalz E.I. Curiously, the Oberursel power plants were license-built copies of an engine designed by French manufacturer Gnome Aeron. The Pfalz E.I was, at 90 miles an hour, faster than its progenitor, and slightly faster than the Fokker Eindecker E.III. It was apparently well liked by some pilots. This improved performance was probably due to its lighter construction. Weighing in at 1,177 pounds fully loaded, this is somewhat less than the E.III version of the Eindecker then in service, which had a loaded weight of 1,345 pounds. While the Eindeckers were built from tubular steel covered in fabric, the E-series were more traditional at the time and built of wood. Around 60 E.Is were manufactured, and it was quickly overtaken by the improved Pfalz E.II, which was basically an E.I with a more powerful Oberursel U1 engine developing 100 horsepower and resulting in a speed increase to just over 93 miles an hour with an improved rate of climb. As far as I can tell, around 120 were manufactured. Further modifications resulted in the E.IV. What happened to the E.III, you might ask? Well, it was a variation of the Morane-Saulnier Type L, and only 4 saw service in April of 1916. I think it is safe to discount it. It was a somewhat different aircraft, though still a monoplane, and doesn't fit into the design path followed by the rest of the E-series. The E.IV featured a strengthened airframe and a more powerful 160 horsepower Oberursel U3 engine. Speed increased again to 100 miles per hour, but by this time the whole lineage was obsolete and only 24 were produced. However, it featured improved armament with 2 MG08-15s. An E.V model was prototyped, featuring a 100 horsepower Mercedes D1 engine, but while 20 were ordered, It is not known if any were manufactured. At this point in the air war, the design life of monoplanes like the Pfalz and Fokker Eindeckers were pretty much at an end, and technology had moved on to small light biplanes, exemplified by the French Nieuports and arguably the German Halberstadts, which had started showing up months earlier in early 1916. Like the Eindeckers, the Pfalz monoplanes were issued to existing reconnaissance squadrons in 1s and 2s for the purpose of escorting the slower two-seaters. Limited numbers were in use from October of 1915. When is a Fokker Eindecker not a Fokker Eindecker? When it's a Pfalz. The success of the Eindecker resulted in all monoplanes involved in the Fokker Scourge being identified as Fokkers by Allied pilots, and the Pfalz was subsumed into that generic label. Comparisons of the two types are difficult to quantify. If the published numbers can be relied upon, the Pfalz aircraft were a few miles per hour faster than the Fokkers and featured a somewhat better rate of climb. Armament was the same. Durability probably favours the Eindeckers with their tubular steel construction. Manoeuvrability is difficult to estimate. Both featured wing warping, which contributed to pilot fatigue. On the other hand, Martin Kreutzer, Fokker's chief designer, had been working for longer and through more design iterations, probably resulting in a more mature aircraft. With a total production of around 200 aircraft of all variants, these numbers should be considered in light of the relatively limited nature of the air war of the time. For comparison, 416 Fokker Eindeckers of all types were manufactured. While probably a worthwhile complement to the Eindeckers and certainly capable of confronting the Allied aircraft of the time, perhaps their most important impact was on Pfalz Flugzeugwerke itself, which took the experience from production into the design process and from the end of 1917 were fielding their own aircraft. In the interim, they began manufacturing designs from Luftfahrzeuggesellschaft, better known under the trade name Roland. Like other fighters that became obsolete, the Pfalz E series continued in use in quieter arenas of the war and were used as trainers. No originals are known to exist. However, a Morane-Saulnier Type H is preserved at the Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace in Le Bourget and another at the Fantasy of Flight in Florida.